James Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe, Elizabethan Secret Service. Officially murdered in 1593, but actually in hiding writing the sonnets. Pardon me, Virgin Queen I may have been, but with a bit of a moustache, it's obvious that one was the real bard. Steady on, Mumsy. Francis Bacon here. Remember your illegitimate son? I was busy encrypting secret messages to prove I was the real William Shakespeare. A real Who Wrote It. The battle commences. Sunday at 8 on BBC2.
On tonight's Late Show, a hands-on session with Tony Blair's media masseur, Alistair Campbell, the California nightmares of Bret Easton Ellis, and flushing away bad design, the making of the new loo. That's the Late Show tonight at 11:15.
BBC2's Newsnight now with Peter Snow.
A better chance than we have known.
They started politely enough, but in a trice they were at it again. Is this really the new politics we were promised? Good evening. John Major faced a new opponent at Prime Minister's Question Time today, but there was precious little new about the style of their confrontation. Maybe the new politics will take a bit more time to evolve. Or is antagonism too built into the system to allow any change? Stephen Dorrell, a fresh face in the Cabinet, discusses the way forward with Labour's Tessa Jowell and that embodiment of plain speaking, Dennis Skinner. With the Queen's entourage in Moscow doing their best to ignore the frantic to and fro of royal tittle-tattle in London, I'll be asking Patrick Cormack, one of the few MPs ready publicly to prescribe some kind of remedy, why he's now urging a royal divorce. And in France, Prime Minister Balladur's government is under fire, with one corruption scandal after another. What price his presidential chances now? Connoisseurs of parliamentary behaviour have been busy looking for evidence of the new political era that was supposed to have dawned today. John Smith's sudden death in the spring set politicians of all parties talking of a less adversarial House of Commons and a broad drive to do something to reduce popular disillusion with politics. Well, today the new opposition leader's first go at John Major was certainly different. He began by congratulating him on progress in Northern Ireland, and he did limit himself to just 2 questions, where Mr. Blair could have had 3. But the 2 men didn't mince their words, and the rest of Question Time looked much the same as ever. Mark Mardell reports.
The opposition's new leader has promised new Labour, new Britain and a new style of politics. One that allows for virtue in political opponents and where disagreement and discord aren't invented for the sake of a cheap soundbite. Trouble is, he's pretty good at the cheap soundbite, and his team are hardly likely to let him squander a prime asset. Many great British entertainments contain more than a hint of aggression, and Prime Minister's Questions is no exception. It's all good knockabout stuff, and not a bad test of whether a politician can withstand the body blows. But if politicians are held in low esteem by the general public for indulging in too much yah-boo politics, then PMQs could be very largely to blame for a decline of faith in the system. And in the last few years, politicians have recognised that something is wrong.
I think people get their impression of Parliament from Prime Minister's Question Time. People hold Parliament in contempt because of the way in which we perform at Prime Minister's Question Time. I think there is now a window of opportunity for reform to take place.
All recent party leaders have expressed a desire to usher in a more mature era of politics and then carried on with business as usual. John Major has expressed his distaste for what he calls ritual confrontation, saying that many would regard it as a very odd affair, a form of theatre.
Unlike the honourable gentleman, Madam Speaker, I've not faced senior members of my party emigrating to New Zealand.
John Smith disliked the inevitability of confrontation and said the whole business was unsatisfactory.
If the whole Cabinet is united, does the Prime Minister not think he should remind some members occasionally to demonstrate that fact in their public utterances?
And Paddy Ashdown has condemned it as pretty irrelevant, a gladiatorial contest.
Is it not illogical to say to the warring partners in Bosnia that if you will not make peace, then we will help you to make a bigger and more bloody war?
Mr. Tony Blair.
Today, the latest leader to talk about reforming Prime Minister's questions kept it fluffy for all of 15 seconds.
Madam Speaker, since this is our first chance after the recess, can I say how much we welcome the further moves towards peace in Northern Ireland and assure him of our continued support in achieving that peace?
Then the brickbats began to fly.
Last Thursday on BBC television, the Chancellor of the Exchequer specifically ruled out a referendum on a single currency. Did he speak for the government?
May I firstly congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman on his new position. It carries with it very great responsibilities, and I wish him well in those responsibilities for so long as he holds them.
The Prime Minister remembered the common courtesies for a little longer, but then things started to heat up to their normal pitch.
The Chancellor takes one view in Europe, his Employment Secretary takes another view, and he hovers between the two. And wouldn't he...
Order! House will come to order. Mr. Blair.
And I repeat, he hovers between the two.
Then Mr. Major started to turn tetchy.
The Right Honourable Gentleman would follow slavishly whatever Europe says. That is not a credible position for any government in this country. We will judge issues on their merits as they arise.
Curious tourists queue up to watch the debates, but it's the eyes of the backbenchers on party leaders that turns them into Rottweilers. Their MPs want morale-boosting blood on the carpet, not subtlety. And it seems voters who'd just watched the contest live for the first time expect it too.
I think it really embodies the essence of parliamentary government in this country, and I liked it very much.
From the outside, certainly seems very contrived, with government backbenchers stating questions which have obviously been planted, and I think that it could do with perhaps a little more spontaneity.
I didn't think it was aggressive enough this time. I was hoping for a few more jibes to make it more amusing.
They were witness to an interesting, if minor, innovation by Mr. Blair, who didn't ask his full 3 questions. The Prime Minister usually saves his sharpest blow for his last answer. By only asking 2 questions this first time, Tony Blair could leave his opponent flailing in the future. His tactic will be to concentrate his questions on areas that can cause long-term problems for the Conservatives, rather than go for the headline-grabbing issue of the moment. But good intentions are unlikely to change the momentum of this institution.
It isn't possible because the whole ethos of the House of Commons is adversarial. It's rooted in hostility between 2 parties and more. And if the reality is hostility, then no amount of courtesy on the surface will ever be able to hide that. So, yes, we could persuade our politicians to pretend to be politer and to cloak their hostility in more courteous words, but the real hostility will always surface.
But some things are changing in the Commons. It's likely that soon MPs will alter their hours to make the place more modern. Some think only structural changes to PMQs will have a lasting effect, from more notice of questions to literally rebuilding the chamber.
I think changing the shape of the chamber, although it's a long-term proposal, would change the psychology of the chamber. Actually, less direct shouting and confrontational attitude, and a more debating, thoughtful attitude where you listen to what other people have to say. It wouldn't be everything, but certainly it would be a contribution towards changing the mentality of your boo that's very prevalent at the moment in the House of Commons chamber.
In these happy times of a terrorist ceasefire, Mr. Major could enjoy the luxury of a stroll back to Downing Street. But an end to the political aggression that evidently dismays the public needs a lot more work on it, if it is possible or desirable at all.
Mark Bardell reporting. Well, now, who better discuss some of these issues with than Dennis Skinner, question time scourge of many a Prime Minister. He joins us from Westminster. Tessa Jowell, a new Labour MP, and Stephen Dorrell, who's the Heritage Secretary, newly in the Cabinet. Stephen Dorrell, what new quality did you notice about today's question time, if any?
I don't think that there was anything very new about it, to be honest. I think that after the initial pleasantries were over, Mr. Blair was seeking to score a party point on Europe, and I thought the Prime Minister answered him very effectively.
So people have been talking a lot of balderdash in the last few months about smartening up the image, have they, changing the nature of politics and so on.
I think you have to remember what Parliament is there for, and Prime Minister's questions as part of the parliamentary process. And one of the key elements in the purpose of the House of Commons, I think, is to represent a cockpit of national debate where, of course, there will be important differences that will be ventilated, will be illustrated in the debate between the two sides. And Prime Minister's Question Time is part of that process. I entirely agree we don't want to be looking for differences where they don't exist, but neither in a democracy do we want to be concealing differences where they do exist.
Tessa Jowell, where was the new style of politics that we thought the Labour Party was promising with the new Mr Blair? There's one who's going to appeal to the disillusioned voters and so on.
Well, Tony Blair did two things today, and the first point that he made was to recognise the achievements that have been made towards peace in Northern Ireland, very much honouring one of the points made in his conference speech to the Labour Party conference a couple of weeks ago, saying, you know, that it wasn't our business to manufacture artificial conflict. Where there was consensus, then we would support that consensus, and that was a very clear example of that.
But the rest of it?
Well, I mean, he then went on to point quite rightly to an area of substantial disagreement in the Tory party and scored a very powerful hit.
Can I just make the point, Peter, that the bipartisan approach to the Irish issue has prevailed ever since the beginning of the Troubles in the early 1970s under both Labour and Tory governments. There's nothing new about that. I welcome the fact there's a bipartisan approach, and I welcome what Tony Blair said about that. But to describe it as new is, I think, stretching the language somewhat.
Indeed, you're only underlining the general sense there was nothing new about Question Time. Dennis Skinner.
The point is, this was Tony's first Question Time, and he began it by making a very important statement about the support for the achievements in Northern Ireland.
Right, Dennis Skinner, did you raise anything new about Question Time?
Well, he started off in a different way, but then again, you've got to bear in mind that different people have different styles. But one thing is absolutely certain, that the idea that people can change it so that you're going to be begging the Prime Minister for help here, there and everywhere is a load of nonsense. I mean, I've been elected on a different ticket from John Major and the rest of this rotten, lousy government. I mean, they've created 4 million people on the dole. The health system is falling apart, so is the education system. Thousands of people on the streets without a roof over their head. Am I supposed to go in the House of Commons and say, please, Mr Major, can you help us? The people out there in Bolsover and throughout the rest of the country amongst the deprived working classes expect us to get stuck into the Tories. That's what I've been sent to do. Now, it is true to say that you do it in a different fashion every so often, because the House of Commons is sometimes like a church and sometimes it's like a zoo. But you have to use whatever implements you can. For instance, satire is very important, and I've used that from time to time, as have many others. Some of the best people have operated by using satire. John Smith was a good example, so was Harold Wilson. But the idea that it's like going to a football match and saying, oh, by the way, I went to a wonderful football match tonight. They didn't score any goals, and our team gave the other side a helping hand, and it was ever so nice, and it was a draw, 0-0. It's a joke.
Okay, but do you not recognise that there is a sense around that the electors out there are expecting something rather different of you in the next couple of years?
I have to tell you that I get hundreds of letters every week from people talking about this business and the way in which we ought to be undermining the Tories because they want them out. And they don't write to me and tell me that I ought to be quiet and nice and docile and beg and crawl on my hands and knees. They ask you to actually get stuck into the Tories and expose them. I mean, today, for instance, John Major talks about being decent and all the rest of it. He was defending Lord Archer. He was defending Mike Thatcher and all the rest of them. Right. I mean, and we're supposed to sit idly by and take it on the chin.
Stephen Dorrell, just to actually quote to you one or two of the things that Mr Major said, just 2 days after John Smith's death in May. There's too much knocking, too much carping, too much sneering. And yet today he has a go at Tony Blair. He says, you'll follow slavishly whatever Europe says. I mean, just like that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very real difference between the line taken by Tony Blair on Europe and the line the government is taking. Tony Blair has made it clear that he wants to lead the Labour Party in a direction that I suspect Dennis Skinner will want to resist. But he wants to lead the Labour Party down the road of a much more federalist, much more centralised European approach, for example, to labour market regulation, introducing into this country labour market practices which on the continent deliver higher levels of unemployment than we have here and rising unemployment at a time that ours is falling. That's the line that Tony Blair wants the Labour Party to pursue, and that's an important difference between his approach and the government, and I think that it's quite right that that difference should be ventilated in the House of Commons.
That is absolute nonsense, but we're not here to discuss Europe.
Well, why is it nonsense?
We're here. Well, it's absolute nonsense because it's a travesty of Labour's position on Europe. But the job, I mean, if I can just go back to Dennis's point. I mean, Dennis makes a very fair point. He's known the House of Commons for far longer than I have. But the job of Question Time is to hold the government to account. But ultimately, it's only the Prime Minister that can have a substantial impact on changing the way in which Question Time is conducted.
Well, how would you do it? In a sentence, how would you change the nature of Question Time or the nature of anything else in the House of Commons, the nature of politics?
One of the ways, I think, in which we could hold the government to account more effectively is by ending the so-called open question and giving notice of questions in advance so we know what the question is, the Prime Minister knows what the question is, and the answer can be properly
Dennis
prepared.
Skinner?
Well, I've never heard anything so daft in the whole of my life. Here's a government, it's got a majority, it's got all the civil servants working for it, it's got every advantage that any government can have, an opposition with very few implements in which to attack, and you're suggesting that you say to the Prime Minister, oh, by the way, I'm going to ask you a nice little question on Thursday.
Well, no, it could be a very unpleasant one, but just give him notice of it.
The net result is that he knows the answer off pat. You can only expose the government and prime ministers by using spontaneity and catching them off balance, and you use all various devices to do it. But the idea that you tell them in advance what you're going to say, I mean, you'd never use it on television.
But the moment the Prime Minister can avoid any question that he doesn't wish to answer, as was very clear today, he read his answer to Tony Blair's question. He was prepared. He knew exactly what he was going to say, and that's not holding the executive.
Stephen Dorrell, whose side are you on, Mr. Giles?
I must say I'm closer to Dennis Skinner than Tessa Jowell on this subject. I think that spontaneity is one of the things that people look for in debate in the House of Commons, and the idea that Prime Minister's questions, the agenda for Prime Minister's questions should be fixed a fortnight in advance, seems to me to deny that spontaneity, to run the risk that PM's questions doesn't address the moment, the issue of the moment on the day.
All right, I just want to move you on, because we just have a couple of minutes left. Is there anything else? Is there any other broad area? I mean, we've heard talk about the Commons ending its sittings at 10 o'clock. Of course, the Labour Party wants to bring more women into the Commons. Is there any other broad area in which in the next couple of years or the next 5 years you think the Commons has to change its image? Dennis Skinner?
Oh, I'll settle for starting early in the morning, finishing at a decent time at night for everybody on a 5-day week, providing that we say to all those Tory MPs and one or two of the others, 250 of them that have got moonlighting jobs that are making money in the city, in the law courts, in the city boardrooms, if we say to the people that members of Parliament paid at £32,000 a year should have one job and one job only and stick to it without any conflict with these other jobs. Now, if we'll do that, then we can start at an early time in the morning and finish at a decent time at night.
Right.
But the reason why we start at 2:30 is because it allows these moonlighting MPs to make money on the side.
I'm very pleased that Dennis has raised an issue that allows me quite clearly to disagree with him. I actually think he's right about hours. I think that the hours of the Commons are widely seen to be ridiculous. But I'm not in favour of saying that MPs should only draw their salary from the taxpayer and should have no outside experience. That seems to me to make up a Parliament of political virgins.
I am with Dennis on this, and I think that changing the hours also provides the proper opportunity to combine constituency responsibilities with parliamentary responsibilities.
Thank you,
Tessa Jowell.
Thank you, Tessa Jowell. Thank you, Stephen Dorrell. Thank you very much, Dennis Skinner, for joining us. Now, if the relationship between the Prince and Princess of Wales has irretrievably broken down, their lawyers, at least, are still speaking to each other. A joint statement from both sides today said there was no truth in claims that a divorce settlement had been agreed. But there's no escaping the talk about it. Westminster is buzzing with gossip, and a number of MPs are privately saying that the quicker the couple make the final break, the better. And that appears to be the view of most people outside Parliament as well. If a poll in tomorrow's Daily Mirror is anywhere near right, 82% said Princess Diana should now divorce Prince Charles. Only 9% said she should not. Any divorce is unpleasant, but as John Nicholson reports, this one would be more difficult than most.
7 weeks from now, Princess Diana will have been officially separated from Prince Charles for 2 years, eligible to petition for divorce. Today, in the aftermath of the Prince of Wales outpourings, few share the Prime Minister's view that nothing stands in the way of her becoming Queen. A divorce certainly would. But it would be as complex as the marriage has been bitter.
There isn't a hole in this thing.
Charles would become the first divorced king of the United Kingdom, virgin territory constitutionally. But, say the experts, there's no law to stop him becoming either king, or for that matter, head of the Church of England, providing he still wants the jobs.
A divorce would have no constitutional consequences at all, either for the succession of Charles as head of state, or for the connection between church and state. That connection is symbolised by the position of the sovereign as supreme governor of the Church of England. But that's a purely symbolic position. It has no constitutional implications, no obligations go with that position. So divorce would make no difference at all to the position of the monarch.
But even if there aren't constitutional impediments, the divorce agreement will be complex. The first problem, what Diana wants and what she'll get. Quoting allegedly from Andrew Morton's new book, the French magazine Voici has claimed that the princess is set to receive £15 million and 2 houses. Lawyers for both Charles and Diana have today denied that they're talking money, or for that matter, divorce. But if and when they do, it's clear that whatever the amount, Diana's payoff will be substantial.
I'd ask her to be aware that just because a man is worth, say, £100 million, doesn't mean a wife is automatically entitled to half of that. However, what's in her favour to get an excellent settlement is the fact that she doesn't work presently, hasn't worked before, isn't really trained to do anything. The fact that she's become used to an excellent lifestyle, and the fact that she wants that to be perpetuated. Also the fact that, to a large extent, she could argue that he deceived her in the first place, right from the beginning in terms of his behaviour. And whilst behaviour often or rarely is taken into account in terms of financial settlements, I'd say let's try it. Why not?
There's another problem too. Charles and Diana have to agree how to bring up their children. Royal childhood and how to survive it. Much in the news since Prince Charles spilled the beans about home life with Prince Philip. Although he doesn't want his own children to suffer anything similar, he's not too happy either about suggestions that Diana might want to take Princes William and Harry to live abroad with her. The royal biographer Elizabeth Longford believes that in any agreement, the royal family will insist in particular on keeping control over Prince William and his education.
I do think that they would feel, and I think they're right to feel, that he should be always in very close contact with his royal relations. However much he was taught it in a book way, he couldn't understand it in the same way as he would by being with them, being part of this, what used to be called magic circle.
The last, and some think the most difficult clause in any divorce agreement, may well govern the behaviour of the divorcing couple. The palace want Diana out of the way. This time, a real retirement from public life. No more briefings, no more books. It's getting an agreement on this, which some believe is holding up the divorce.
It is very important to see that any agreement made with the Princess of Wales is binding and that she lives by any agreement of this type. Obviously, in the old days before the First World War, unfortunately, a cyanide tablet might have been used to take care of the situation, but today we're more civilized and more evolved, and one doesn't expect to resort to those tactics, though the Princess of Wales is certainly very much of an unguided missile, and you have no idea what she's going to do next. This is the main reason that the announcement of the divorce plans has been held up, because the agreement will be complicated and probably take quite a long time.
In other words, the palace would like what the Americans call a gagging clause, an end to public mudslinging, either directly or through ciphers. But experts say that unlike mud, gags are hard to make stick.
A gagging clause could well be obtained. For example, he could recite a promise from her to say nothing at the beginning of any financial consent order. But ultimately, if they want a judge to approve such a financial order, a judge might say, what is the point of me approving of something that is going to be unenforceable? If she breaks the gagging clause, the promise, what on earth is Charles going to do? Is he really going to go to court and seek that she be committed to prison, or even seek damages? It's fruitless, it's pointless. Therefore, all in all, there's no point having it.
Far from London, on her state visit to Russia, the Queen is said to be deeply disturbed at how once again her family's emotional travails are dominating the front pages at home. It's a measure of how far attitudes towards royal behaviour have changed during her reign, that people are now not only anticipating a royal divorce, but some are even welcoming it, as the only possible escape for all parties from what our eldest son has called the Greek tragedy of his married life.
Well, the Conservative MP Patrick Cormack has publicly urged the royal couple to get divorced today. Many of his colleagues have also talked about it, but privately. Patrick Cormack, what's made you go public?
Let me say at once that I think it's a tragedy that we're having to have this discussion. I deeply deplore the fact that this whole thing has occupied so much attention over the last 3 years. I think that the Princess of Wales was guilty of gross misjudgment when the Morton book came out, and although the Dimbleby book is much more serious, much better written, better researched, I still think the Prince of Wales again is guilty of gross misjudgment and miscalculation in allowing it all to come into the public arena.
That's quite a thing to say about a future king, isn't it?
Well, I'm very sorry, but he has brought this into the public arena. I've admired the Prince of Wales for many years, and I still do. He's a man of great talent, great ability, and I've always felt that he could be a very good king. But he has done, I'm afraid, great damage to the institution of monarchy by the way in which this whole business has been handled. I deeply deplore that, and I very much regret it. But the fact of the matter is, when the separation was announced 2 years ago, I was one of those who hoped very much that there would be a reconciliation, that these two young people would come together again, and that they would once more provide a united and happy home for their children. It seems inconceivable that will happen. There seems enormous bitterness and recrimination, and therefore, although I'm not one of those who likes the great divorce statistics we have in this country, I believe that in this particular case, divorce is the answer, and the sooner the better, frankly. And then they can both begin to pick up the pieces and live independent lives, I hope, without either the prurient gaze of the media or inviting that gaze.
Do you think there can be anything done in any divorce settlement to stop them squabbling in public? You heard this idea of some kind of gagging clause. Do you think it would make any sense?
I very, very much hope that the Princess of Wales will retire from public life and will enjoy the rest of her life in peace and quietness and all the rest of it. I very, very much hope that the Prince of Wales will never again feel obliged, as he obviously did, to unburden himself in this way. I think that the fact that the book has come out is in itself a pity. The extracts, which are all that 99% of the people who read any of the book will actually read, seem to concentrate entirely upon the personal aspects, relations with parents, relations with wife, things one really shouldn't talk about in public. I think the whole thing is deeply distressing, but the sooner we can move on to another chapter, the better. And so long as these two people are married, unless they really came together for a proper reconciliation, as long as they're married, it's going to go on. There's a cancer at the centre of our public life now, and it's got to be cured.
What do you think should happen to the children if they are divorced, Mr. Cormack?
I think this is the most distressing aspect of it of all, and I think the fact that the children are old enough to be able to read and take in some of it and know what's going on is very, very distressing. But Prince William is likely to succeed to the crown one day. His brother could. I think it is important that they are indeed educated close to the royal family. I believe the custody should be with the father, obviously provisions for access for the mother, but I really do believe that they should be preserved so far as possible from any further embarrassments. But I really do feel very strongly for them. It's a terrible business.
Just one last question. You did cast your doubts on the judgment of the Prince of Wales in allowing this book to be written, giving his help for this book. Do you think he has the judgment to be king now?
Well, I hope and pray the Queen will reign for many, many long years, and dust can settle and people can learn from mistakes. And he is a man of sensitivity, he is a man of considerable abilities and talents, which I believe should now be devoted entirely to the British people.
Patrick Cormack, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, in a moment we report from Paris as French Prime Minister Edouard Balladur's administration is dogged by corruption scandals. But first a look at the rest of the day's news. The Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin's office has strongly denied radio reports tonight that the Prime Minister has resigned due to ill health. Speculation over Mr. Chernomyrdin's position was fuelled when he failed to meet the Queen on her arrival at Moscow airport yesterday. The Defence Minister Roger Freeman has announced plans to improve standards at the atomic weapons establishments at Aldermaston and Bergfield in Berkshire. The sites will have to gain a government licence to operate. It follows a highly critical report by inspectors from the Health and Safety Executive. Relatives of the 51 people killed in the Marchioness riverboat disaster have succeeded in having the inquest into their deaths reopened 5 years after the nighttime collision. Captain of the Marchioness was twice put on trial for negligence, but both times the jury failed to agree and he was acquitted. One of the bow doors of the sunken ferry Estonia has been found 1.5 miles to the west of the wreck lying in the Baltic Sea. Investigators believe that damage to the bow doors was responsible for the ferry disaster, which claimed 900 lives 3 weeks ago. The South Korean government today said that it accepted the nuclear agreement due to be signed by the North Koreans, and the United States later this week will remove all nuclear threat. In exchange for access to modern nuclear technology, the North has agreed to open its facilities to inspection and to scrap the old-fashioned atomic power plants capable of producing plutonium. The Rover Car Group is recruiting an extra 1,500 staff in the Midlands to cope with growing demand. Most of the jobs will be at Longbridge near Birmingham. The rest are at Land Rover in Solihull and Swindon. The Labour MPs Tony Benn and Doug Hoyle are believed to be considering joining Bill Mickey in his decision to resign tomorrow from the House of Commons Privileges Committee. They're protesting at the decision to hold the Cash for Questions inquiry in private. The inquiry was called after 2 MPs agreed to accept £1,000 each from Sunday Times journalists in return for tabling parliamentary questions. The Conservative majority on the committee tonight voted to take evidence behind closed doors. Now a look at tonight's markets. The FTSE 100 share index closed 35 points lower at 30.85. In New York, the Dow ended 6 points lower, closing at 39.17. Against the mark, the pound rose 0.7 of a pfennig to 2 marks 42.3, and against the dollar, the pound rose 1/5 of a cent to finish the day at $1.61.3. The French Prime Minister Edouard Balladur called an extraordinary meeting of his cabinet tonight to appeal for calm after a wave of corruption scandals which has rocked his government. 2 cabinet ministers have already resigned, and one of them is now in jail. A further 4 ministers have been named in other corruption investigations. The French media has talked of little else for the past few weeks, with revelations of financial malpractice appearing every day. And as each new scandal emerges, the standing of Prime Minister Balladur's once extraordinarily popular government slides further. Kirsty Lang reports from Paris.
The media may have found the French Prime Minister a little dull when he first came to power, but the public responded to his rather solid bank manager appearance. After the corruption scandals that had driven the socialist administration from power, Edouard Balladur was seen as Mr. Clean. Events of the last few days, however, have tarnished the image of his government. On Friday night, the French industry minister resigned after allegations of corruption mounted against him. Gérard Longuet, one of the new young bloods of the centre-right and a close friend of the Prime Minister, is accused of getting his villa in the south of France refurbished at a cut-down price in exchange for awarding government construction contracts to a building firm. But unusually for a French politician, Edouard Balladur is determined not to let friendship and political cronyism interrupt the course of justice.
It's everybody's responsibility to define some sort of new moral contract between the citizens and their political representatives. We must remove French politics from the shade of suspicion.
Last week, the former telecommunications minister Alain Carignan became the first minister of the Fifth Republic to be unceremoniously carted off to prison, also on charges of corruption. A rather shadowy deal involving the privatisation of water helped bring Carignan down. Like many French ministers, Carignan was also the mayor of a provincial town. He's accused of accepting over £2 million in gifts in exchange for awarding contracts to companies, including the privatisation of the water system in his hometown of Grenoble. By plunging the murky depths of local government finances, Balladur's clean-up campaign has uncovered more than anticipated.
I think Mr. Balladur has been deeply surprised by all he is now discovering, because he hasn't been himself involved in running a political party. He has never had any major political responsibilities in the Gaullist party, the RPR, I mean in terms of organizing things, financing and all that. And he has never been mayor of a big town or president of a regional council or, you know, that sort of thing. So, of course, he is probably discovering things as the French people are themselves discovering.
The transfer of power to the town halls in the early 1980s under Mitterrand's decentralisation policy provided plenty of opportunity for financial wrongdoing. It used to be said that not a centime could be spent in the provinces without someone in Paris knowing about it. As MPs and ministers hold on to their positions as mayor while in national office, there is the opportunity for some to use their local power bases to raise money for their political campaigns and in some cases their own pockets. But François Fromont-Maurice, who's the mayor of a small town outside Paris, believes that the climate of the 1980s provided the temptation.
The spirit of this decade, during which money has been changed into sort of a goddess, and people wanted to make money. By any means, they wanted to make money. And also a few politicians. Money has been hitting the French society in a way the French society was not ready for.
The excesses of the 1980s proved the downfall of the former mayor of Nice. He stands accused of accepting a free holiday in the Seychelles from this local haulage firm and of creating an entirely fictitious job for his glamorous wife, who was on the books as working in this municipal car park on a salary of over £4,000 a month.
But it's not just a case of individual politicians lining their pockets. Much of the scandal that's currently rocking the French establishment has to do with the financing of political parties, who in the past filled their coffers with under-the-table donations from private enterprise. Well, the law relating to that has since changed, and parties will now have to rely on their membership and subsidies from the state in order to finance their expensive election campaigns.
The arrival of glitzy American-style electioneering in the 1980s put more pressure on the political parties to raise money whichever way they could. The then ruling Socialist Party was probably responsible for some of the worst excesses, culminating in the raiding of their headquarters before the last election. But demanding donations in return for political favours was endemic to both left and right. Maurice Levy, who is the president of one of France's largest advertising firms, was often approached by political parties asking for free advice on running their campaigns.
We have been asked several times. We have been asked to finance some advertising campaign. We have been asked to pay some few operations, and we have always refused. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we have so little coming from the government, because we have not been friend of any government, because we have always refused.
So you mean you've never had government contracts as a result?
We have very little as a result.
The former treasurer of the Socialists now believes that any connection between big business and politics should be discouraged.
You cannot say that there is no corruption when there is a business financement. That's why, after a long thinking in France, almost all the parties now think this should be suppressed. Because you cannot control which way the money comes to the party and which way the party uses this money. And I believe, from what I have read, that the way parties are financed in Great Britain can be dangerous if people have not got a very strong virtue.
But the other change is that the judiciary are now being allowed to do their job. Thierry Jean-Pierre is a former investigating magistrate who left his post disillusioned with the constant political interference. He was responsible for looking into the financing of the Socialist Party and now believes that there are many more scandals waiting to emerge.
On en est encore à des niveaux moyens de corruption, les affaires de grande corruption, les affaires...
We're still dealing with moderate levels of corruption. The really big deals yet to come out involve commissions on arms sales or on international markets, embezzlement of European or third world subsidies. All this is yet to come out. When the magistrates start to look into this kind of thing, it's obvious that far more important members of the economic world will be involved, and the politicians who've benefited from these deals will be more numerous and more important.
The parallels with the Italian situation are notable. After decades of political interference in the system of justice, French investigating magistrates have finally been given a free hand. In the words of one newspaper editorial, justice is finally brandishing its sword and striking. But that sword is also threatening to strike at the Prime Minister's own popularity. Earlier tonight, the Prime Minister summoned his entire cabinet for a meeting to discuss the current crisis, which has yet to run its course. 4 more of his cabinet ministers have the shadow of doubt hanging over them, including Defence Minister François Léotard. Mr Balladur's goal is to run for president when François Mitterrand steps down next year. But most recent opinion polls show he is losing his position as one of the most popular prime ministers in recent French history. The odour of suspicion that surrounds all of French politics at the moment is proving difficult to escape.
Kirsty Lang from Paris. Well, one apology before we end. We said earlier that the captain of the riverboat Marchioness was tried. Actually, it was the captain of the Bow Bells who was put on trial and subsequently acquitted. The morning papers, very quickly, a very mixed bunch of headlines. The royal couple deny plans for divorce in The Times. The Times editorial says the marriage of the prince and princess, under the heading of private decision, marriage of the prince and princess is their predicament rather than ours. They should be allowed to make their own decisions with dignity. The Financial Times, the best it can do is to tell us that Sir David Walker, the Deputy Chairman of Lloyds Bank, is to move to Morgan Stanley. The Independent, Tories bid for centre ground on schools. Independent interview with Gillian Shepherd finds her expressing reservations about vouchers for nursery places and the introduction of more grammar schools. Daily Telegraph has cuts in the Treasury. Whitehall mandarins facing massive job cuts. Today has the story, it says, of claims of how Princess Diana is obsessed with her husband's mistress, Camilla Parker Bowles, and complained to the Queen about it once. And The Sun has the much more important story than any of these. The ladies' captain of a posh golf club has quit after she's caught romping semi-naked with the goodness knows what. Right, that's all from Newsnight tonight. The next news business breakfast 6 tomorrow morning with breakfast news an hour later. We're back tomorrow night at 10:30 p.m. Till then, from all of us, good night.